Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel for another history video, where today we're going to be talking about something you've probably seen spoken about a lot on social media in the past few weeks. If you're from the UK, you've probably heard of the Windrush Scandal, but you might not know exactly what the Windrush Scandal is. I know I only had a very basic understanding before I decided to do some research into it for myself. I wasn't even planning on making this a video, but I figured I might as well impart my newfound knowledge onto you guys. I don't know whether this is necessarily part of my history series or not, as the scandal only broke in 2018, but it will become history though, and a very important part of history at that. But before we get into this video, I just want to take a really quick moment to talk about a non-profit organisation who contacted me recently. I think what they do is great and I want to share it with you all just in case you're interested in their services or want to help out. This is absolutely not an ad, I'm not being paid in any way to talk about them. I just want to share what they do really quickly because it really matches with the ethos of my channel. Academus Education is a newly developed non-profit organisation whose aim is to make classical studies and ancient history accessible for everyone. Academus is achieving this by offering a free online summer school as well as one-on-one tutoring sessions for university applicants to help disadvantaged students across the country. The summer school is 2 weeks long, introducing students to Greek and Latin language, historiography and classical texts. Students also gain access to exclusive talks with leading authors and professors in their fields. The one-to-one coaching service is specifically designed for students in Year 12 or the equivalent who are considering studying a classical subject at university and require extra admission support not offered at their current schools. Their coaching sessions assist with course choices, applications, personal statements and interview practice, including for Oxbridge candidates. I'll leave all of their social media links down below in case you want to go and have a look at them and just have a closer look at what they do. And also they are run on donation, so if you're in a position to be able to donate, I know they would really appreciate it. I just want to take more time in my videos to share worthy causes and charities. I have a pretty decent sized platform now, and you never know who of my audience it could help. Also, it helps a non-profit as well. It's a pretty win-win situation. Again, this is absolutely not an ad, I just thought I would share them with you in case you're interested. But anyway, let's get back to Windrush. So in very basic terms, the Windrush Scandal refers to a British political scandal in which people were wrongly detained, denied legal rights and threatened with deportation. At least 83 people were wrongly deported from the UK by the Home Office. Many of the deported people had been born as British subjects or had arrived in the UK before 1973 as part of the so-called Windrush generation. Between 1948 and 1971, roughly 550,000 people from the Caribbean migrated to the UK. The British Nationality Act of 1948 gave UK citizenship status and the right of settlement in the UK to anyone who was at that time a British subject, aka anyone who'd been born in a British colony. British colonialism is a whole video for another time. I'm not just brushing over that, we will talk about that another time, but it's big. After World War II and the huge amount of death that happened because of that, Britain found itself with serious labour shortages and a shattered infrastructure. There simply weren't enough workers to help rebuild the country, so the British government started a campaign in its Caribbean countries to bring people over. The British Nationality Act combined with the government campaign meant that a huge amount of working age adults and their children travelled over to the UK from the Caribbean. The name Windrush is a reference to the ship NV Empire Windrush, the first ship to arrive from the Caribbean at Tilbury Docks in Essex on the 22nd of June 1948, bringing 492 passengers from Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago mainly, but also other islands. These people had the legal right to come to the UK, they were legal citizens, they didn't need any documents upon arrival to the country. Whole families would come over with children travelling on the adults' passports, meaning these children had literally zero documentation or identification. The Home Office themselves destroyed thousands of landing cards and other records relating to Windrush in 2010 during an office move. So it's hard to know for sure exactly how many people came over in Windrush because of the lack of records kept. It wasn't easy for people coming over from the Caribbean. These were people literally uprooting their whole world in search of a new life over in the UK. There was intense national debate in the UK as to whether these foreigners should be allowed into the country, even as the Empire Windrush was on its way over with the first passengers. But these people were British citizens. The people on the boat didn't even know if the boat was going to be allowed to dock. But those first passengers were allowed to disembark, and they were housed in the Clapham South Deep Shelter, a bomb shelter that was dug during the war. The nearest job centre was in Brixton, so many people began to settle around that area of London. As you may recall in my video on the Admiral Duncan bombings, I mentioned that Brixton is known to be an incredibly multicultural area of London. Windrush is partly the reason for this. Brixton is where the job centre was when people came over from the Caribbean. People soon began to get jobs in all kinds of sectors, but mainly within the NHS, British Rail and public transport, very important areas of British infrastructure. The people in the Caribbean were obviously encouraged by the British government to come over and work in the UK. All of these people thought they were going to be welcomed with open arms. They were coming over to save the UK economy after all. And these people were raised being taught that they were English too, thanks to colonialism. They had no idea of the level of discrimination they would experience when they arrived. I mean, this was late 1940s England and racism was very much still rife. But the racism these people faced on the streets wasn't the only issue. Let's not forget that institutionalised racism as well. Many had trouble finding accommodation, people not wanting to sell or rent to black families. They weren't able to open bank accounts or get mortgages, and therefore the Caribbean community were forced to establish many of their own organisations, such as the West Indian Standing Conference, in an attempt to get equal treatment. There was a general housing shortage in the UK after the war, especially in London and other big cities, because a lot of housing had been destroyed in the bombing. This led to clashes between the white population and the black newcomers. The white people believed that they should be the ones getting housed in their own country, but the Windrush incomers were also British citizens by all rights. The clashes led to many a riot, the most famous of which was the 1958 Notting Hill riot, which lasted for 2 weeks. In response to the riot, a Caribbean carnival was set up in 1958, which is still going strong today as the Notting Hill Carnival. In the years following 1948, many of the countries that the Windrush generation had come from became independent of the UK, and therefore the people living there became citizens of their own countries. Legislation in the 60s and 70s began to limit the rights of citizens of these former colonies, who are now simply members of the Commonwealth, to come and work in the UK. The influx ended with the 1971 Immigration Act, and anyone who had arrived in the UK from a Commonwealth country before 1973 was granted an automatic right to permanently remain unless they left the UK for more than 2 years at a time. This is where the confusion begins, I suppose. The people who were granted the automatic right to remain were never given any documentation or asked to provide any documentation. There was nothing official. They were just told, if you arrived here before this date, you can stay. This is where the confusion begins, I suppose. The people who were granted the automatic right to remain were never given any documentation or asked to provide any documentation. They were just told, if you arrived in the country before this date, you can stay. There was nothing official. These people continued to work and live in the UK fully believing themselves to be British, which they were. And you've got to remember that we're not just talking about working age adults here. Many children were born in the UK to Caribbean-born parents. These children never knew anything other than being British. They were British, raised and educated in the UK system, leaving school and getting jobs, buying houses, having families of their own. They never had any reason to think they didn't belong in this country. But many of them never applied for travel documents, never applied for passports after their arrival in the UK. It's thought that of the 550,000 people from the Caribbean who migrated to the UK during Windrush, roughly 50,000 of them who remained in the UK, because of course many of them did return back home, never regularised their residency status, which is according to Oxford University. After 1973, a British passport holder born overseas could only settle in the UK if they firstly had a work permit and secondly could prove that a parent or grandparent had been born in the UK. And so we come to the Windrush Scandal, which began to surface in 2017. It emerged that hundreds of Commonwealth citizens, mostly from the Windrush generation, had been wrongly detained, deported and denied their legal rights in the UK. The scandal came about due to new legislation introduced in October 2012 called the Hostile Environment Legislation. It essentially tasked the NHS, landlords, banks, employers and many others with enforcing immigration controls. It basically comprised of legislative measures to make staying in the UK as difficult as possible for people without leave to remain. Basically make life for immigrants as hard as possible in the hope that they would leave the country voluntarily. Theresa May, who was at the time the Home Secretary, literally said, "The aim is to create here in Britain a really hostile environment for illegal immigrants." And they really did this. Only the problem is that they didn't just make life hard for the illegal immigrants, which I think is quite shitty of them to do anyway, but they also made life pretty difficult for people of the Windrush generation, who had every single right to be in the country. The Conservative government had pledged to keep annual net immigration in the tens of thousands, which was controversially low at the time, but was running about 250,000. So this Conservative government were determined to reach their targets and get that number down by any means necessary. During Theresa May's 6 years as Home Secretary, she presided over 7 immigration bills and 45,000 changes to the immigration rules. As of 2017, stories started to leak out about the treatment of people who came to the UK as part of the Windrush generation. A highly publicised case was that of Albert Thompson. He'd arrived in London as a teenager and had lived in London for 44 years. He was diagnosed with prostate cancer and turned up to his first radiotherapy session, only to be told that he would be charged £54,000 for treatment unless he could produce a British passport. Albert didn't have a passport, he'd simply never applied for one. And despite having worked as a mechanic and paid taxes for more than 3 decades, taxes that helped fund the NHS, he was denied treatment, and then he was evicted from his home, leading him to be homeless for 3 weeks. He wasn't able to get his treatment for a further 6 months, and this could have potentially been the difference between life and death for some. He was only able to get his treatment after his case was picked up by the media. And then there's Anthony Bryan, who was born in Jamaica in 1957 but came to England when he was 8 years old with his mother. He attended school in London, leaving at 16 to work. He paid UK taxes for more than 40 years. In 2015, Anthony went to apply for a British passport, as he thought he was entitled to, but the Home Office's immigration enforcement contractor, Capita, told him he'd actually be deported from the UK as he had no right to stay. He loses his job after immigration warned them of his status, saying that they could be fined £10,000 if they continued to employ him as a legal worker. Anthony then couldn't claim benefits as he didn't have enough documents to identify himself. He'd lost his Jamaican birth certificate during the move in his childhood, and he travelled over on his older brother's passport, as was allowed at the time. In 2016, police and immigration took Anthony to an immigration detention centre where he was held for over 2 weeks, and he was told he was going to be sent back to Jamaica. Luckily, his case grew publicity, and a last-minute intervention by an immigration lawyer and his Labour MP allowed him to stay in the UK. Glenda Caesar was a 59-year-old NHS worker who travelled over from the Dominican Republic with her mother and aunt when she was just 6 months old. She was sacked from her job in a GP's practice that she'd held for over 16 years due to her immigration status, and was subsequently denied unemployment benefit. The Home Office has since calculated that she should receive over £22,000 in compensation to cover loss of earnings and the general impact on her life the stress has caused. But is this enough when the scandal made her so low that she debated ending her life? Those are just 3 quick stories out of thousands. People all across the UK suddenly found that the country they'd called home for all or the majority of their lives was trying to push them out. You would feel betrayed, hurt. You would have spent the last 40 years paying taxes towards your country, only then to be denied free healthcare, employment and benefits when you needed them most. And these people that began to get caught out by the Home Office weren't young people. A huge amount were beginning to enter retirement age, a time of life when you should finally relax, live your best life without the stresses of working, spend time with your family. The last thing you need as you hit retirement age is the stress of your own country trying to kick you out back to a country you haven't been to since you were a child, a country you have no memories of. But not only was it mental stress, many people were actually arrested and forced into immigration centres. Some were even deported back to the countries that they'd never ever known. As I previously mentioned, it wasn't until the end of 2017 that the British media started to report on the Windrush Scandal. Whilst the affected people were primarily identified as members of the Windrush generation and mostly from the Caribbean, people from other countries were also affected. People from Kenya to Canada were affected by the hostile environment policy. The press accused the Home Office of operating a guilty until proven innocent regime. It was the job of the people to prove their residency in the UK with zero help from the government. Because as I previously said, the Home Office had destroyed many documents pertaining to people's entry into the country during Windrush. And that became the people's problem, not theirs. The government have since said that the decision to dispose of the landing cards had been an operational decision taken by the UK Border Agency instead of the Home Secretary at the time, Theresa May. A Home Office spokesman said, registration slips provided details of an individual's date of entry. They did not provide any reliable evidence related to ongoing residence in the UK or their immigration status. So it would be misleading and inaccurate to suggest that registration slips would therefore have a bearing on immigration cases whereby Commonwealth citizens are proving residency in the UK. But it probably would have been helpful to have landing cards showing these people arrived before 1973, right? Showing they'd entered the UK from the Commonwealth before the immigration cut off. The Home Office began to make unreasonable demands for documentary proof of these people's rights to live in the UK. Some people were asked to provide 4 documents for every single year they'd lived in the UK. Let me ask you, could you provide proof that you've lived in your home country for every year since you've been born? The Home Office said that reliable evidence of ongoing residence consisted of things like school records, exam certificates, employment records, bills and doctor's notes. Could you find a doctor's note from when you were 10 years old? Because I know I certainly couldn't. School records should be easy, you think. But do you think a primary school will keep records of a child that attended 45 years ago? Probably not. For people who had already been deported by this point, they then had to contend with contacting the Home Office from overseas to prove they belonged in the country. When the story broke in the media, the International Development Secretary said there was absolutely no question of the Windrush generation's right to remain in the UK. A review of historical cases found that at least 83 people who had arrived before 1973, though, had been deported. By this time, the Home Secretary was now Amber Rudd, and she resigned as the scandal unfolded. She originally publicly claimed that the Home Office had no deportation targets, but then less than 24 hours later admitted that immigration officers did have some targets for the number of people they should deport, leading to her resignation just a few days later. And this isn't a good thing, because if you give immigration officers a set number of people they should be deporting, are they going to find people to deport that shouldn't be deported just to reach these numbers? And who was Prime Minister by this point, I hear you ask? None other than Theresa May, the Home Secretary who'd passed the hostile environment legislation just a few years earlier. She said the controversy had arisen because of rules that she had implemented. She apologised to Caribbean leaders, saying that she wanted to dispel any impression that my government is in some sense clamping down on Commonwealth citizens, particularly those from the Caribbean who have built a life here. She stressed that it was her fault that these were rules implanted by her, but this resulted in some people, through no fault of their own, now needing to be able to evidence their immigration status. And the overwhelming majority of the Windrush generation do not have the documents they need, but they're working hard to help them out, apparently. She said, those who arrived in the Caribbean before 1973 and lived here permanently without significant periods of time away in the last 30 years do have the right to remain in the UK. So that's the Prime Minister saying this, the woman who implemented these rules in the first place. So why is it still happening? They established a new task force and helpline for those who had been affected, but this was little comfort for people who literally lost their jobs, lost their right to healthcare and their benefits. They were still having to prove their right to remain. On the first day of the hotline, 49 active cases were flagged, which was just the tip of the iceberg. An independent article from just last week states that more than 160 members of the Windrush generation may have been wrongly detained or deported, but more than 1,270 claims have been made to a compensation scheme set up for people affected by the scandal. Theresa May said that members of the Windrush generation would be compensated where appropriate though, and figures from May 2020 shows that less than 5% of claims have been paid out, with just 60 people receiving their share of £392,996. That shows the extent to which people were financially affected by this. That's a big number between 6 people. The government have also said that if you're settled in the UK but do not have a document to prove it, you may be eligible to apply to the Windrush scheme. It's free to apply for citizenship if you're a Commonwealth citizen who settled in the UK before the 1st of January 1973, or if you're the child of someone who did. But should someone who was born in this country have to go through the rigmarole of then applying for citizenship? It doesn't seem right, does it? An independent review by Wendy Williams began on the request of the newest Home Secretary to provide an assessment of the events that led up to the scandal and to identify the key lessons for the Home Office. The review was released in full in March 2020, and I would like to read this particular excerpt verbatim because it sums up pretty well. Wendy writes, What is clear to me is that operational and organisational failings of the department had a causative impact on the detrimental treatment received by the Windrush generation as a result of them being caught up in measures designed for people who have no right to be in the UK. In particular, their history was institutionally forgotten. Accurate records were not kept both in relation to individual cases and the development of relevant policy and legislation as a whole. The legal landscape related to immigration and nationality has become more complicated rather than less so, and even the department's experts struggle to understand the implications of successive changes in the legislation and the way they interacted with changes in the relationship between the UK and Caribbean countries and the resulting impact those changes had on individual status in the UK. Opportunities to correct the racial impact of historical legislation were either not taken or could have been taken further. According to Home Office papers from the time, those administering the 1987 registration scheme said they intended the advertising to be informative but not stimulate a flood of inquiries. Publicity leaflets from the time also explained there would be no consequences if people chose not to register at that time. It's not unsurprising that some people did not register. For a little bit of context there, in the mid-80s, the government basically asked people of the Windrush generation to register as citizens of the country, but also said that you don't need to do it right now, just at some point, but also didn't really push that scheme out there, so most people had no idea about it. Even people who worked in the Home Office at the time didn't know about it, so how were the actual people meant to know about it? Wendy wrote of her findings. Whilst I'm unable to make a definitive finding of institutional racism within the department, I have serious concerns that these failings demonstrate an institutional ignorance and thoughtlessness towards the issue of race and the history of the Windrush generation within the department, which are consistent with some element of the definition of institutional racism. So basically, the Windrush Scandal wasn't found to be inherently racist, but partly due to blame of ignorance around race. Wendy made 30 recommendations for areas the Home Office and government need to improve on to ensure that something like this doesn't happen again, including for the Home Office to go further to right the wrongs, to look beyond the Caribbean, to tell the stories of the Empire, Windrush and their legacy, and assess and limit the impact of the hostile environment on the Windrush generation. The review makes it clear that the scandal was not an accident. It was inevitable as soon as the new policies came out designed to make life impossible for people without the right papers. This scandal is something that's still very much ongoing. People are still being deported, although the government are saying they're trying to make contact and right the wrongs. People had huge losses, financial, medical, mental, due to what happened. People made homeless, literally thrown out onto the streets. And this wasn't accidental. This was Theresa May's plans when she implemented the hostile environment policy. This is what she wanted. And this is still happening to people who are not part of the Windrush generation as well. It's a pretty brutal policy. Whatever your stance is on illegal immigration, forcing people out onto the streets and potentially into danger is pretty inhumane treatment. Even during the pandemic, this policy still hasn't been suspended. This is all far from over. Justice has still not been done and there's a huge backlog of cases to be resolved. There hasn't even really been a proper apology from the government, not really. The 22nd of June each year marks the National Windrush Day, marking the anniversary of the arrival of the Empire Windrush into Tilbury Docks. As someone who lives in the UK, it's pretty shocking that I'd never heard of Windrush Day until researching for this video. The government needs to do more to educate people in this part of the country's history. And this is a really important part of our history. Black people from the Caribbean came over and helped rebuild this country after the war. We begged them to come over and help. And then we thanked them by trying to illegally kick them out once they reached their old age. Thank you so much for watching this video. I just thought it would be really interesting to share this with you. It's something that you see everywhere all the time, the Windrush Scandal, but you don't really know the ins and outs of it unless you actually take the time to research it. So if you're interested, I hope you found this very educational. Make sure you go check out Academus in the description box down below if it sounds like something you would be interested in. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys.